Before the Gilded Age ended, it left behind monuments that were never meant to survive it. Across America, mansions rose as symbols of absolute confidence. They were built on the assumption that wealth was permanent, that fortunes would outlive generations, that excess itself was proof of success. For a brief moment, it seemed true. Entire neighborhoods were reshaped by private money. Cities competed in marble, limestone, and gold leaf. The largest houses ever built stood as declarations that the future belonged to those who could afford it. Then, the world changed. Wars, taxes, economic crashes, and public resentment dismantled the foundation that had supported those palaces. One by one, the great estates disappeared, demolished for profit, abandoned under crushing costs, donated because families could no longer afford to keep them alive. What survived were fragments, photographs, and ghosts of an era that collapsed almost overnight. And yet, one house did not follow that fate. High in the mountains of North Carolina, far from financial centers and social rivalries, the Biltmore Mansion remained standing. Not untouched, not unchanged, but alive. Still owned by the family that built it, still operating as a functioning estate more than a century later. By every rule of history, it should have failed first. It was the largest private home ever built in America, one of the most expensive to maintain, remote, labor-intensive, and born from an age that modern society rejected. And yet, while others vanished, Biltmore endured. This is not a story about wealth alone. It is a story about foresight, sacrifice, and relentless adaptation. About decisions that offended pride but preserved legacy. About why one impossible mansion refused to die when everything like it did. If you want to understand how the Gilded Age truly ended and why one estate survived its collapse, this story begins here. If you enjoy deep-dive documentaries on lost empires, forgotten fortunes, and the hidden mechanics behind history's most powerful families, subscribe and stay with us. The illusion of permanence is the most dangerous belief wealth can create. At the height of the Gilded Age, America's richest families believed their fortunes were untouchable. Railroads stretched across continents, steel and oil reshaped the economy. Money moved faster than laws, faster than public opinion, faster than restraint. The men who controlled these industries built houses that were not meant to be lived in quietly. They were meant to announce dominance. Marble facades on Fifth Avenue, summer palaces in Newport, mansions designed to impress rivals, intimidate guests, and anchor family names into the landscape itself. But nearly all of them made the same mistake. They built monuments to status, not systems designed to survive. The costs of those houses were hidden at first. Construction could be paid for with surplus wealth. Staff could be hired easily. Maintenance felt trivial when money seemed infinite. Yet every one of those houses depended on a fragile equation: uninterrupted income, low taxation, cheap labor, and a society willing to tolerate extreme private excess. When even one of those conditions changed, the entire structure collapsed. And change came quickly. Income taxes rose. Estate taxes followed. Labor costs increased. Social attitudes shifted. The public stopped admiring excess and began questioning it. The very houses that once symbolized success became symbols of irresponsibility. Families who could afford to build them could no longer afford to keep them. Biltmore should have been the most vulnerable of all. It was larger than any private home ever built in the United States. Larger than the Fifth Avenue mansions. Larger than the Newport cottages. More remote, more expensive to staff, more expensive to heat. More expensive to repair. It required an army of workers and a steady flow of money simply to function at a basic level. Yet, while others fell, Biltmore endured. The reason begins with a decision made decades before the first stone was laid. George Vanderbilt did not build Biltmore where wealth traditionally displayed itself. He avoided New York. He avoided Newport. He avoided proximity to competitors. Instead, he chose isolation, mountains. Distance, land measured not in city lots, but in square miles. That choice baffled his contemporaries. It would later save everything. Biltmore was conceived not as a seasonal palace, but as a permanent residence. That distinction mattered more than anyone realized at the time. Seasonal houses could be abandoned without consequence. Permanent estates demanded planning beyond social calendars. They required infrastructure, power generation, water systems, food production, transportation, land management. From the beginning, Biltmore was designed to operate as a self-contained organism rather than a decorative shell. This was not accidental idealism, it was philosophical. George Vanderbilt believed wealth carried responsibility. Not responsibility in the philanthropic sense that later industrialists embraced, but responsibility to build something coherent, useful, and lasting. He admired European estates not because they were extravagant, but because many had survived centuries of political upheaval, war, and social transformation. They endured because they functioned as economic systems, not just residences. American mansions rarely followed that model. Most were built as expressions of momentary dominance. They depended entirely on continued fortune. They had no fallback when the tide turned. Biltmore was different. Its forests were not decorative, they were managed. Its farms were not symbolic, they were productive. Its infrastructure was not borrowed from surrounding towns, it was built on site. Electricity, heating, water, refrigeration, all were integrated into a single operational framework. Even the scale of the house reflected this thinking. Enormous, yes, but designed for use, not spectacle. Rooms were meant to be occupied, fires were meant to burn daily, systems were meant to run continuously. Yet even this foresight did not make Biltmore invincible. When George Vanderbilt died in 1914, the estate faced its first real test. The man who had funded its existence was gone. The world was changing. World War I began that same year, shattering the European culture that had inspired Biltmore's creation. The Gilded Age, though not yet named, was ending in spirit if not in calendar. This is where most estates failed. Heirs inherited houses without inheriting the philosophy that created them. They saw monuments, not mechanisms. They protected appearances while ignoring expenses. They clung to tradition while the financial ground beneath them eroded. Biltmore avoided that fate because its next steward did not see the house as sacred. Edith Vanderbilt did not romanticize the estate. She analyzed it. She understood that beauty without discipline was unsustainable. Where George had built according to vision, Edith governed according to reality. She reduced staff, closed unused spaces, controlled spending. She treated Biltmore not as an untouchable relic, but as a living structure that had to justify its continued existence. That mindset alone separated Biltmore from nearly every other Gilded Age estate. But discipline was not enough. By the late 1922, even the most carefully managed private estates were becoming impossible to maintain. Taxes rose sharply. Investment income shrank, labor became expensive. Public hostility toward inherited wealth intensified. Then the stock market collapsed. The Great Depression destroyed fortunes that had seemed eternal. It was during this moment that Biltmore faced a decision that defined its future. Continue pretending it was a private world, or accept that survival required reinvention. Edith chose reinvention. Opening Biltmore to the public in 1930 was not a gesture of generosity. It was an act of survival. By allowing ordinary Americans to walk through rooms once reserved for elites, the estate transformed from private burden into public asset. The house gained relevance in a world that no longer tolerated secrecy or excess without justification. This single decision altered everything. Biltmore stopped depending entirely on inherited wealth. It began generating income, modest at first, but steady. More importantly, it aligned the estate's survival with public interest. As long as people cared, the house had a reason to exist. Then came the most painful sacrifice of all. The sale of over 80,000 acres of land to the federal government reduced the estate dramatically. What had once been a vast, self-contained domain was cut to a fraction of its original size. Yet this loss preserved the core. The house survived. The forests became protected public land. The original vision of stewardship endured in a different form. This willingness to sacrifice scale in order to preserve essence is the central reason Biltmore refused to fail. Other families refused to shrink. They refused to adapt. They preserved pride until there was nothing left to preserve. Biltmore accepted transformation as the cost of survival. By the mid-20th century, the estate was no longer a Gilded Age residence in any traditional sense. It was a hybrid, part home, part business, part cultural institution. That hybridity made it resilient. When tourism alone was not enough, new revenue streams were introduced. A winery, hospitality, events, experiences that respected the house without exploiting it. Crucially, the house itself was never compromised. Modern systems were added invisibly. Climate control protected interiors, Fire suppression guarded irreplaceable craftsmanship. Restoration replaced decay before it became disaster. The estate evolved technologically while remaining architecturally intact. This balance change without erosion is extraordinarily rare. Most historic houses fail because they either resist adaptation or surrender entirely to commercialization. Biltmore walked the narrow path between the two. It refused to become irrelevant. It refused to become disposable. And because of that, it endured. Biltmore did not survive because it was the largest. It survived because it was treated as something that had to earn its future. Every generation confronted the same question: what must change so that this can remain? That question, asked repeatedly and answered honestly, is why Biltmore still stands when nearly everything like it does not. The story of Biltmore is not a story of frozen grandeur. It is a story of constant negotiation with reality. A mansion that refused to fail not because it was protected from history, but because it was willing to face it head-on. The hardest part of preserving a legacy is not building it. It is keeping it alive when the world no longer wants what it represents. By the middle of the 20th century, Biltmore existed in a kind of historical limbo. It was too large to function as a private home in the old sense, too personal to become a conventional museum, and too expensive to survive on sentiment alone. The Gilded Age had ended decades earlier, and the cultural tide had turned decisively against inherited excess. What had once been admired as ambition was now viewed as imbalance. Wealth, especially old wealth, was expected to justify itself. For Biltmore, justification became survival. After Edith Vanderbilt's death in 1958, the estate entered its most fragile phase. The emotional anchor that had held everything together for more than 40 years was gone. What remained was a magnificent structure, shrinking landholdings, rising costs, and a public that was fascinated by the house but unwilling to subsidize it out of reverence alone. This is the moment when many historic estates finally break. The heirs face a brutal arithmetic. Maintenance costs rise faster than income. Property taxes do not care about history. Roofs leak. Stone erodes. Labor laws change. Insurance premiums climb. Every year, the gap between what the estate costs and what it earns widens. At some point, even great houses must choose between liquidation and reinvention. Biltmore stood on that edge. The temptation to sell was real. Developers would have paid handsomely for the land. The house itself, stripped of its contents, could have been converted into a hotel, an institution, or divided into sections. That path would have been easy, logical, final. Instead, the family chose something harder. They chose to make Biltmore function as a modern enterprise without turning it into a caricature of itself. This required abandoning the last illusions of aristocratic detachment. The estate could no longer operate as if money simply appeared when needed. It had to plan, forecast, diversify, compete. Biltmore had to become something its creator never intended, a business with a historical soul. Tourism alone was not enough. Admission fees paid some bills, but not all. Seasonal fluctuations made revenue unpredictable. Economic downturns reduced travel. The house needed stability. That stability came from understanding something George Vanderbilt intuitively grasped but never had to fully implement. Land must work. The remaining acres of the estate became assets rather than scenery. Hospitality operations were expanded carefully, always placed away from the main house to protect its integrity. Guests could stay on the property without occupying the mansion itself. This distinction mattered. The house remained the heart, not the commodity. Then came the winery. At first glance, it seemed like an odd addition. Wine production in the mountains of North Carolina did not fit traditional expectations, but in reality, it aligned perfectly with the original vision. George Vanderbilt had believed in agricultural experimentation. He had studied European estates where vineyards were integral to land stewardship. The winery was not a departure from the past. It was a continuation of it. More importantly, it worked. Wine sales generated consistent income. Events and tastings drew new visitors. The estate gained a revenue stream that was not dependent on foot traffic through historic rooms. This financial diversification insulated Biltmore from the volatility that had destroyed other properties. Slowly, deliberately, the estate built a portfolio of experiences rather than relying on a single attraction. This strategy was not without risk. Every addition carried the danger of dilution. Too much commercialization could cheapen the house. Too little adaptation could bankrupt it. The margin for error was narrow. What kept Biltmore balanced was restraint. Nothing was allowed to compromise the house itself. No gift shop spilled into historic rooms. No modern alterations disrupted original design. Restoration followed conservation standards rather than convenience. Changes were hidden, reversible, and respectful. The house was treated as irreplaceable capital, not decorative backdrop. Behind the scenes, modernization was relentless. Climate control systems were installed to protect wood, textiles, and paintings. Fire suppression technology guarded against catastrophic loss. Electrical systems were upgraded quietly. Plumbing was maintained continuously. Every year, millions of dollars were reinvested simply to keep the building standing. This is a truth most visitors never see. Historic houses do not decay dramatically. They deteriorate slowly, invisibly, through moisture, vibration, temperature change, and neglect. Survival depends not on occasional restoration, but on constant intervention. Biltmore embraced that reality. It planned decades ahead. Maintenance was not deferred. Small problems were solved before they became irreversible. This discipline separated Biltmore from estates that collapsed under the weight of deferred upkeep. At the same time, the family accepted another difficult truth. The era of living full-time in the mansion was over. Privacy and preservation could no longer coexist in the same way. The house belonged to history as much as to its owners. The family adapted by maintaining private spaces elsewhere on the property, preserving the house for what it had become. This decision, too, was an act of preservation rather than loss. By redefining what ownership meant, the family ensured continuity. They remained stewards rather than occupants. That distinction allowed the estate to function without erasing its lineage. Public perception shifted as well. Biltmore stopped being seen as a symbol of obscene excess and began to be viewed as a survivor, a place that had weathered depression, war, and social upheaval. Visitors did not come merely to marvel at wealth. They came to understand how such a structure could still exist. Education became part of the mission. Interpretation emphasized craftsmanship, labor, and innovation rather than indulgence alone. The story expanded beyond the Vanderbilts to include the workers, the land, and the systems that sustained the estate. Biltmore became a lens through which to examine the entire Gilded Age, not just its glittering surface. This shift mattered. Houses that survive do so because people believe they are worth preserving. Relevance is protection. When a place helps society understand itself, it gains allies beyond its owners. Biltmore cultivated that relevance carefully, avoiding nostalgia while honoring history. By the late 20th century, something remarkable had happened. Biltmore was no longer merely surviving, it was thriving. Not as it once had, but as it needed to. Revenue streams were diversified. Preservation was systematic. Public interest was strong. The estate had become resilient. This resilience was tested repeatedly. Economic recessions came and went. Tourism patterns shifted. Cultural tastes evolved. Through it all, the guiding principle remained unchanged. Adapt without surrendering identity. That principle is why Biltmore refused to fail when logic said it should. Other mansions were built to impress a moment. Biltmore was forced to negotiate with time. Every generation faced the same uncomfortable question. What are we willing to change so that this can continue? Each answered differently, but always with the same underlying commitment. Not to grandeur, not to status, but to survival with integrity. Biltmore stands today not because it was protected from history, but because it engaged with it honestly. It accepted that no structure, no matter how magnificent, is exempt from economics. It learned that preservation is not passive. It is active, strategic, and often uncomfortable. The mansion refused to fail because its stewards refused to pretend that the world would accommodate it. Instead, they adapted. And in doing so, they turned an impossible relic of the Gilded Age into something even rarer, a living legacy that continues to earn its place in the present. Survival, once achieved, creates a new problem. Once a great estate proves it can endure, expectations change. Preservation becomes assumed. Continuity becomes obligation. Every decision is no longer just about staying alive, but about justifying why survival matters at all. For Biltmore, the late 20th century introduced this quieter, more complex challenge. The house was no longer at immediate risk of collapse, yet it faced something just as dangerous, becoming irrelevant through familiarity. By the 1,970 and 1,000 980 seconds, Biltmore had crossed a threshold few Gilded Age estates ever reached. It had outlived its era, its creator, and the social system that made it possible. The danger now was stagnation. History does not reward places that merely exist. It rewards those that continue to speak. Biltmore had to explain itself to a world that no longer measured success in acres or servants. The United States that entered the late 20th century was not impressed by inherited grandeur. It was shaped by mobility, efficiency, and skepticism toward institutions that symbolized inequality. Younger generations questioned why a single family still owned America's largest private house. Preservationists admired the architecture, but critics saw a relic of excess. Tourism brought revenue, but it also brought scrutiny. Every visitor asked the same unspoken question: why should this still be here? Answering that question required reframing the entire meaning of the estate. The narrative could no longer center solely on wealth. That story had expired. Instead, Biltmore positioned itself as evidence of craftsmanship, innovation, and long-term stewardship. The emphasis shifted from what it cost to build to what it took to maintain, from opulence to effort. This was not cosmetic storytelling. It shaped real decisions. Educational programming expanded. Tours highlighted engineering systems, labor histories, and land management. The story of the estate became broader than the Vanderbilt family. It included foresters, craftsmen, servants, architects, and farmers. Biltmore was presented not as a fantasy, but as a functioning organism sustained by human systems. This reframing was critical. Houses that survive do so because they align with contemporary values. For Biltmore, that alignment came through sustainability, before sustainability became fashionable. Long before environmentalism entered mainstream culture, the estate had practiced controlled forestry, soil restoration, and agricultural experimentation. These were not retroactively imposed narratives. They were embedded in the estate's DNA from the beginning. As environmental awareness grew, Biltmore's history suddenly felt modern. The forests were no longer symbols of private excess, but of early conservation. The land sale that created Pisgah National Forest was reevaluated not as loss, but as foresight. What once looked like surrender now appeared visionary. Biltmore became part of a longer American story about balancing private ownership with public good. At the same time, the estate faced practical pressures that never eased. Preservation is expensive in ways that cannot be romanticized. Stone does not care about sentiment. Roofs fail whether history is respected or not. Plumbing ages. Electrical systems become obsolete. Each year, the house demanded attention, labor, and money. The difference now was that failure would not be dramatic. It would be gradual. Deferred maintenance would accumulate invisibly until restoration became impossible. Avoiding that fate required discipline bordering on obsession. Budgets were structured years in advance. Restoration projects were prioritized not by visibility, but by urgency. Decorative improvements took a back seat to structural integrity. Visitors saw elegance. Behind the scenes, engineers and conservators fought entropy daily. The house became less a monument and more a patient under constant care. This approach stood in contrast to many historic sites that relied on crisis-driven restoration. Biltmore refused to wait for disaster. Prevention became policy. That philosophy alone saved millions of dollars and incalculable heritage. Yet discipline was not enough. To survive culturally, Biltmore had to remain emotionally relevant. It had to feel alive, not embalmed. This is where programming became essential. Seasonal events, exhibitions, and traditions connected the estate to living memory rather than distant history. Christmas at Biltmore, garden festivals, concerts, and community events transformed the house into a recurring presence in people's lives. Visitors returned not just to see rooms, but to experience atmosphere. This emotional continuity mattered. It created personal connections across generations. Families returned, year after year. Children grew up associating Biltmore with memory rather than museum fatigue. That loyalty translated into stability. At the same time, the family remained intentionally visible. This was a subtle but powerful decision. Biltmore did not hide behind institutional anonymity. It did not become a faceless trust or state-managed property. The continued involvement of Vanderbilt descendants reinforced the idea of stewardship rather than extraction. Decisions were framed as long-term commitments, not quarterly calculations. This continuity of ownership provided something rare in American preservation: accountability across generations. If a decision harmed the estate, it would harm the family name attached to it. That restraint shaped priorities. Short-term profit was repeatedly rejected in favor of long-term viability. Even so, challenges multiplied. The late 20th and early 21st centuries brought new pressures. Security concerns increased, insurance requirements grew stricter, accessibility standards required careful adaptation. Climate change introduced unpredictable weather patterns that threatened gardens, roofs, and forests. Tourism became more competitive. Attention spans shortened. Once again, Biltmore faced a familiar question: adapt or fade? The response followed the same pattern as before: adapt, but deliberately. Technological integration accelerated, but invisibly. Digital ticketing streamlined operations without altering experience. Conservation science advanced quietly behind closed doors. Data analysis informed staffing and visitor flow. The estate became sophisticated without becoming sterile. This balance was difficult to maintain. Too much modernization risked erasing atmosphere. Too little risked inefficiency. Biltmore navigated that tension by preserving sensory experience while modernizing infrastructure. Visitors still heard footsteps echo in stone halls. They still smelled wood fires in winter. They still felt scale and silence. What they did not see were sensors, controls, and systems working constantly to protect that illusion. Illusion, in this case, was preservation. By the time Biltmore entered the 21st century, it had achieved something no Gilded Age estate was ever designed to accomplish. It had become future-facing. Not in style, but in mindset. Decisions were no longer reactive. They were anticipatory. The estate planned not for the next season, but for the next generation. This long view shaped everything. Financial models assumed volatility. Land use prioritized resilience. Staffing emphasized expertise over tradition. Education focused on context rather than glamour. The house stopped trying to represent wealth and started representing endurance. That shift is why Biltmore feels different from other historic houses. It does not ask to be admired uncritically. It invites understanding. It acknowledges contradiction. It stands as evidence that survival requires compromise without surrender. Perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Biltmore's refusal to fail is that it was never guaranteed. At every stage, collapse was a rational option. Selling would have been easier. Donating would have been respectable. Demolition would have been profitable. Survival was chosen again and again, despite inconvenience. That choice was never sentimental. It was strategic. It required accepting that legacy is not something you protect by freezing it in time. Legacy survives only when it is allowed to evolve. Biltmore did not survive because it was protected from reality. It survived because it confronted reality earlier than anyone else. As the world continues to change, the house remains vulnerable. It always will. No structure of this scale is ever secure. But vulnerability, acknowledged and managed, has become its strength. Each challenge reinforces the same lesson that has guided Biltmore for more than a century. Grandeur fades, systems endure, and only those willing to adapt without abandoning purpose can carry the past into the future. That is the real reason Biltmore refused to fail. Failure at Biltmore never arrived as a single dramatic moment. It crept forward slowly, disguised as routine expense, cultural indifference, and the quiet erosion that time imposes on anything large, old, and expensive. What makes Biltmore extraordinary is not that it avoided collapse once, but that it repeatedly recognized collapse approaching and changed course before it became irreversible. By the late 20th century, the estate had already survived wars, depression, taxation, and social upheaval, but survival created a dangerous illusion of safety. Many historic properties fail not during their first crisis, but during the long calm afterward, when vigilance fades and systems age quietly. Biltmore faced that risk more than once. The house itself was aging into a new category of problem. Built with 19th century materials and techniques, it now had to endure 20th and 21st century expectations. Visitors expected comfort, safety, and accessibility without sacrificing authenticity. Governments demanded compliance with modern codes. Insurers demanded risk mitigation. Preservationists demanded restraint. The estate was pulled in opposing directions simultaneously. Each demand carried cost. Stone facades needed constant inspection. Limestone eroded imperceptibly until it didn't. Rooflines spanning hundreds of feet faced storms that climate patterns were making more severe. Wooden interiors responded to humidity changes with warping and cracking. Textiles faded, paintings aged. Fire remained the single greatest existential threat. One spark could erase everything George Vanderbilt had built. Preserving Biltmore became less about aesthetics and more about engineering. Behind the scenes, the house turned into a site of continuous scientific management. Conservators monitored temperature and humidity room by room. Engineers analyzed structural load. Electricians retrofitted systems that had been advanced in 1895 but dangerously obsolete a century later. Fire suppression systems were installed with surgical care to avoid visual intrusion. Every improvement required negotiation between safety and authenticity. This work was invisible to most visitors, which is precisely why it mattered. Historic houses rarely fail because of a single catastrophe. They fail because small problems accumulate until intervention becomes impossible. Biltmore refused to let problems age unchecked. It invested heavily in prevention, even when the results were unseen and uncelebrated. That discipline extended beyond the house itself. The surrounding estate, though dramatically reduced from its original size, still required constant stewardship. Thousands of acres meant roads, forests, waterways, and wildlife management. Neglecting the land would eventually endanger the house. Erosion could undermine foundations. Flooding could damage infrastructure. Forest mismanagement could invite disease or fire. The original vision of land as responsibility, not ornament, persisted. Forestry practices continued to emphasize regeneration over exploitation. Trails were maintained. Water systems were monitored. The estate was treated not as scenery, but as a living buffer, protecting the core. This long-term thinking stood in contrast to many preserved properties that treated land as expendable once the main structure was secured. At the same time, Biltmore faced an unavoidable cultural shift. By the turn of the 21st century, public patience for symbols of inherited wealth had narrowed. Museums, historic sites, and cultural institutions were expected to justify their relevance. Visitors wanted context, not reverence. They wanted to understand how places like Biltmore fit into broader histories of labor, inequality, innovation, and environment. Ignoring that expectation would have been fatal. Biltmore responded by expanding interpretation beyond celebration. The narrative widened to include servants' lives, construction, labor, agricultural workers, and foresters. The estate acknowledged complexity rather than polishing myth. This honesty increased credibility. Visitors trusted a place willing to confront its own contradictions. Trust translated into longevity. Education became a form of preservation. By teaching visitors how fragile the estate actually was, Biltmore built public support for its continued existence. People no longer saw admission as voyeurism. They saw it as participation in preservation. This shift altered the emotional contract between the house and its audience. Visitors became stakeholders. At the same time, the estate refined its economic model to match modern realities. Tourism alone was vulnerable. Weather, fuel prices, pandemics, and global instability could disrupt travel overnight. Biltmore needed insulation against unpredictability. Diversification was the answer, but it had to be disciplined. Hospitality expanded carefully, never overwhelming the historic core. Events were curated to align with the estate's character. Commercial activity was confined to areas designed to absorb traffic without harming the house. Revenue generation became sophisticated, data-driven, and deliberately restrained. This restraint is what separates Biltmore from places that slowly lose their identity to commercialization. Every potential expansion faced the same question: does this support preservation, or does it exploit it? If the answer leaned toward exploitation, the idea was abandoned. This principle protected the house even when financial temptation was strong. Another threat emerged quietly: generational transition. Family stewardship is both strength and vulnerability. Continuity allows long-term planning, but it also requires each generation to choose responsibility over liquidation. Estate taxes, inheritance laws, and shifting family dynamics have destroyed countless historic properties. Passing a structure as massive as Biltmore intact from one generation to the next requires extraordinary foresight. Legal structures were carefully designed. Financial planning extended decades ahead. Ownership was treated not as entitlement, but as obligation. Each transition required preparation long before it occurred. Mistakes could not be undone later. This approach demanded patience rare in modern economics. Short-term profit was consistently rejected in favor of sustainability. Biltmore accepted slower growth in exchange for endurance. That trade-off frustrated critics who measured success by expansion, but it protected the estate from volatility. Then came moments no plan could fully anticipate. Economic recessions tested visitor numbers. Global crises disrupted travel. Maintenance costs rose regardless of income. Labor shortages strained operations. Each disruption required adjustment without panic. The estate responded with flexibility rather than retrenchment. Operations scaled temporarily without sacrificing standards. Maintenance schedules were preserved even when revenue dipped. Investments were delayed strategically rather than canceled recklessly. The long view remained intact. This ability to absorb shocks without structural compromise is the clearest evidence of Biltmore's evolved resilience. Perhaps the most significant transformation, however, occurred at the level of identity. Biltmore gradually stopped defining itself as a survivor of the Gilded Age. That framing was backward-looking and finite. Instead, it positioned itself as a case study in adaptive stewardship. The focus shifted from what the estate once represented to what it demonstrates now. That difference is crucial. Survivors who cling to origin stories eventually become irrelevant. Survivors who reinterpret purpose remain necessary. Biltmore's modern relevance lies not in its scale, but in its process. It shows how large, complex systems can adapt ethically. It demonstrates that preservation is not nostalgia, but continuous decision-making under constraint. It reveals that legacy is not static inheritance, but active responsibility. This reframing allowed the estate to speak to contemporary concerns: sustainability, conservation, labor, climate, and cultural memory. The house became a platform rather than a monument. Standing inside Biltmore today, visitors are not simply observing the past. They are witnessing the cumulative result of thousands of decisions made to prevent disappearance. Every maintained room, every restored surface, every preserved view is evidence of intervention. Nothing remains by accident. That truth reshapes how the estate is perceived. Grandeur becomes secondary to effort. Beauty becomes inseparable from maintenance. Survival becomes the most impressive feature of all. In this sense, Biltmore's refusal to fail is not heroic. It is disciplined. There were no single moments of salvation, no grand rescues, only continuous recognition that failure was always possible and never allowed to feel distant. Other estates failed because they treated decline as unthinkable until it was unavoidable. Biltmore treated decline as inevitable unless actively resisted. That mindset made all the difference. The mansion still stands not because it escaped history, but because it internalized history's lessons earlier than most. It learned that permanence is a myth, but continuity is achievable. It learned that preservation without adaptation is decay in disguise. It learned that beauty must be defended daily. As long as those lessons remain central, Biltmore will continue to do what it has always done best. Not resist change, not deny reality, but absorb pressure, adjust structure, and move forward intact. That is why, more than a century after it should have failed, Biltmore remains standing. Longevity is not passive. It is not granted by age, size, or reputation. It is earned through constant negotiation with forces that do not care about history. By the time Biltmore entered the 21st century, it had already done something no other private American mansion had achieved. It had crossed from being a relic of wealth into being an operational institution without surrendering family ownership. That alone placed it in a category of one. But that achievement carried a new burden. Survival was no longer enough. The estate now had to prove that its continued existence made sense in a world facing economic inequality, environmental strain, and cultural reassessment of the Gilded Age itself. The danger was no longer bankruptcy. The danger was moral irrelevance. Modern audiences no longer accept grandeur at face value. They interrogate it, they ask who built it, who maintained it, who benefited, and who paid the hidden costs. Any historic estate that fails to answer those questions risks becoming a symbol of everything contemporary society seeks to move beyond. Biltmore did not evade that scrutiny. It leaned into it. The estate's interpretation evolved deliberately. The story widened beyond the Vanderbilt family and their vision. It began to include the thousands of laborers who quarried stone, laid pipe, carved wood, cooked meals, cleaned rooms, and maintained land. The narrative acknowledged hierarchy, power imbalance, and the realities of service labor without collapsing into condemnation or nostalgia. This balance mattered. Places that sanitize their past lose credibility. Places that frame themselves solely through guilt lose coherence. Biltmore chose complexity. It allowed contradiction to exist alongside admiration. That choice kept the story intellectually honest and culturally resilient. At the same time, the estate confronted another modern pressure: scale. Biltmore is not simply large, it is logistically extreme. Hundreds of thousands of square feet, miles of corridors, acres of roofline, tens of thousands of objects that require conservation. Even with modern efficiencies, the estate operates like a small municipality. Utilities, staffing, security, transportation, waste management, environmental compliance. Every system must function daily, without interruption. Any failure compounds. A plumbing issue in a modern house is inconvenient. At Biltmore, it can endanger historic fabric. A power outage is not merely uncomfortable, it risks climate stability for art and interiors. A staffing shortage is not an inconvenience. It threatens safety, access, and maintenance schedules. Operating Biltmore means anticipating failure before it occurs. This is where the estate's long memory becomes its greatest asset. Over more than a century, Biltmore has experienced nearly every kind of crisis. Financial collapse, war, labor shifts, cultural backlash, technological obsolescence, environmental stress. Each response left institutional knowledge behind. Mistakes were remembered. Successes were refined. Very few historic properties possess that depth of operational experience. Most are rescued late, after damage has already occurred. Biltmore learned early that rescue is expensive and unreliable. Prevention became doctrine. This doctrine extends to staffing philosophy. In the Gilded Age, labor was abundant and cheap. That world is gone. Today, Biltmore relies on highly trained specialists: conservators, engineers, horticulturalists, archivists, historians, safety professionals. These are not interchangeable roles. They require education, certification, and continuity. Retention became as important as recruitment. The estate invested in professional culture, institutional loyalty, and knowledge transfer. Losing a skilled conservator is not like replacing a seasonal employee. Years of experience leave with them. Biltmore learned to value expertise as much as architecture. This focus quietly reshaped the estate's identity. It became less about showcasing rooms and more about sustaining processes. The mansion is what visitors see. The systems are what allow it to exist. Over time, Biltmore came to represent not just what America once built, but how it can choose to care for what remains. This shift placed the estate into conversation with modern concerns about sustainability. Long before sustainable tourism became a buzzword, Biltmore practiced controlled access, land management, and resource conservation out of necessity. Overuse damages historic fabric. Underuse threatens relevance. The estate calibrated visitor flow carefully, balancing income against preservation. This discipline was tested repeatedly. In years of high tourism, pressure mounted to increase capacity. More visitors meant more revenue, but more visitors also meant more wear. Biltmore repeatedly chose restraint. Capacity was managed. Timed entry systems were refined. Paths were reinforced. Floors were protected. Growth was slowed deliberately. Short-term gain was sacrificed for long-term survival. This approach frustrated some observers who saw untapped profit potential, but it protected the estate from the fate of historic sites that become victims of their own popularity. Another challenge emerged from an unexpected direction: authenticity fatigue. As heritage tourism expanded globally, visitors became more discerning. They recognized scripted experiences. They resisted overly curated narratives. They sought authenticity not just in architecture, but in honesty. Biltmore responded by allowing the house to show its age. Restoration focused on conservation rather than replacement. Patina was preserved. Wear was contextualized rather than erased. The estate resisted the temptation to make the house look new, understanding that age itself was evidence of survival. This choice aligned with a broader cultural shift toward valuing imperfection as proof of endurance. At the same time, Biltmore continued to invest heavily in unseen modernization. This paradox, preserving age while installing advanced systems, required precision. Technology had to disappear into the structure without altering its character. Success was measured by invisibility. Visitors experienced warmth without seeing vents, safety without noticing suppression systems, stability without sensing climate control. The illusion of timelessness depended entirely on modern intervention. That illusion is fragile. One failure could shatter it. A fire alarm malfunction, a flood, a structural failure. Each risk required planning that extended beyond conventional preservation models. This is where Biltmore's private ownership again proved decisive. Public institutions often face funding cycles, political shifts, and bureaucratic delays. Decisions are debated, postponed, compromised. Biltmore's governance allowed for faster response, longer planning horizons, and unified vision. This does not mean decisions were easy. Private ownership magnified responsibility. There was no government safety net, no guaranteed funding. Every major investment carried risk borne by the family. That risk sharpened discipline. Each generation faced the same fundamental question. Does this decision increase the probability that the estate will exist 50 years from now? If the answer was unclear, caution prevailed. This future-oriented thinking shaped the estate's response to emerging threats. Climate variability began affecting the region more noticeably. Heavier rains, stronger storms, temperature fluctuations all posed new risks. Drainage systems were upgraded, landscape management adjusted, emergency protocols evolved. Again, these changes were proactive, not reactive. Biltmore refused to wait for catastrophe. Meanwhile, cultural relevance continued to evolve. The estate increasingly positioned itself as a place of learning rather than spectacle. Programs explored architecture, land use, history, craftsmanship, and conservation. The mansion became a teaching tool rather than a trophy. This educational role strengthened public support. People defend what they understand. By explaining the complexity behind preservation, Biltmore transformed visitors into advocates. Admission became participation. Tourism became stewardship. This psychological shift is one of the estate's most important achievements. Places that rely solely on admiration are vulnerable. Places that foster responsibility endure. As decades passed, Biltmore's identity stabilized into something unprecedented in American history. A privately owned, publicly engaged, financially self-sustaining historic estate operating at national scale. That balance remains delicate. Rising labor costs continue to challenge budgets. Insurance markets fluctuate. Regulatory expectations evolve. Cultural attitudes toward wealth remain volatile. No amount of history grants immunity. But the estate no longer depends on immunity. It depends on adaptation. The lesson repeated across Biltmore's survival is simple and demanding. Nothing stays saved unless it keeps earning its place. George Vanderbilt built Biltmore as a personal vision. Edith Vanderbilt transformed it into a survivable one. Subsequent generations reshaped it into a living institution. Each stage required surrendering something cherished to preserve something essential. Scale was surrendered to save the house. Privacy was surrendered to gain relevance. Illusion was surrendered to earn trust. What remained was purpose. Biltmore today does not exist because it is the largest mansion. It exists because it has learned to justify its existence in every era it passes through. That is why it refused to fail when others disappeared. Not because it was protected, not because it was lucky, but because it accepted that survival is never guaranteed, only negotiated. And as long as that negotiation continues honestly, relentlessly, the house in the Blue Ridge Mountains will remain standing. Not as a relic of excess, but as proof that even the most improbable legacies can endure when stewardship is treated as a lifelong obligation rather than a historical accident. There is a moment in the life of every long-surviving institution when endurance itself becomes its greatest vulnerability. Once a place has outlived expectation, it risks being misunderstood as inevitable. People assume it will always be there. They stop asking what it costs, what it requires, and what sacrifices are being made to keep it alive. For Biltmore, this illusion has been as dangerous as bankruptcy ever was. Because nothing about Biltmore's survival is guaranteed. By the early decades of the 21st century, the estate had achieved something extraordinary. It was financially stable, culturally relevant, and structurally intact. Visitors arrived in numbers unimaginable during the Depression years. The house was celebrated as a triumph of preservation. It appeared, from the outside, to have solved the riddle that destroyed every other Gilded Age mansion. But survival at this scale creates a new pressure: expectation without patience. Modern audiences expect seamless experiences. They expect safety without inconvenience. They expect access without limitation. They expect historical authenticity and modern comfort simultaneously. And they expect all of this to exist without visible compromise. Biltmore cannot meet these expectations without constant friction. Every year, decisions must be made that disappoint someone. Limiting visitor numbers protects floors but frustrates demand. Restricting access preserves rooms but angers curiosity. Closing areas for restoration prevents damage, but interrupts experience. Raising ticket prices supports preservation, but invites criticism. These are not marketing problems. They are existential trade-offs. Unlike publicly funded institutions, Biltmore cannot absorb losses indefinitely. Every decision reverberates through the entire operation. Revenue supports maintenance, maintenance supports access, access supports relevance, relevance supports survival. Break any link in that chain, and the system destabilizes. This fragility is why Biltmore's leadership has become increasingly conservative in the most strategic sense of the word. Not resistant to change, but deeply cautious about unintended consequences. Every initiative is tested against one overriding question: does this make the estate easier or harder to preserve 20 years from now? The answer is rarely obvious. One of the most persistent threats comes from success itself. High visitor numbers increase wear exponentially. Stone staircases erode under constant foot traffic. Wood floors compress. Micro-vibrations affect plaster. Air quality changes as bodies move through enclosed spaces. Even human breath alters humidity levels over time. These effects are cumulative and irreversible. The estate has responded by embracing controlled experience rather than unrestricted access. Timed entry, defined routes, and guided flow are not conveniences. They are defensive strategies. The house is not designed for modern crowd dynamics. It was built for a world where dozens of people occupied it, not thousands per day. Protecting the structure means accepting limits. This acceptance has required cultural education. Visitors are encouraged to understand why they cannot touch certain surfaces, why photography is restricted, why movement is directed. Preservation is framed not as denial, but as participation. Each restriction becomes an explanation of fragility. This transparency builds trust. Places that enforce rules without context breed resentment. Places that explain necessity create allies. Biltmore has learned this lesson through decades of trial and error. Another pressure point lies in technology. Modern systems age faster than historic materials. Electrical infrastructure installed 30 years ago may already be obsolete. Digital platforms require constant updating. Security systems evolve. Climate control technologies advance. The paradox is that preserving a 19th century house requires constant engagement with 21st century innovation. Standing still is impossible. Yet adopting new technology carries risk. Every system installed today will eventually need replacement. Every intervention alters the building in subtle ways. Wiring must be hidden. Sensors must be placed. Equipment must be housed. Each addition, however discreet, accumulates. The estate has responded by treating technology as temporary by design. Systems are installed with reversibility in mind. Nothing is allowed to permanently compromise historic fabric. This approach increases cost and complexity, but preserves future flexibility. It is an investment in uncertainty. Because the future will demand changes no one can currently anticipate. Climate patterns are shifting. Visitor behavior is evolving. Regulatory environments change. Cultural values shift. Biltmore cannot predict the specific challenges ahead, but it can prepare structurally for adaptation. That preparation extends to land use. The remaining acres of the estate are no longer passive assets. They are strategic buffers. Forest management reduces fire risk. Watershed protection prevents erosion. Landscape planning absorbs environmental stress. The house depends on the health of its surroundings more than ever. This interdependence reflects a broader philosophical shift. Biltmore no longer presents itself as a self-contained monument. It acknowledges that its survival is tied to ecological, economic, and social systems beyond its walls. This humility is not weakness, it is realism. The estate exists within a living region. Its future is connected to community stability, environmental stewardship, and regional resilience. This connection shapes public perception. Biltmore is no longer seen solely as an elite artifact. It is increasingly understood as an economic engine, an employer, a conservation steward, and a cultural resource. This reframing protects it politically and socially. Places that serve only memory are vulnerable. Places that serve living communities gain allies. Yet even this position is precarious. Economic inequality remains a sensitive issue. Any symbol of historic wealth attracts scrutiny. Biltmore walks a narrow line between transparency and defensiveness. It must acknowledge privilege without apology, history without justification, and preservation without arrogance. This balancing act is ongoing. Education has become the estate's most powerful tool in navigating this terrain. By contextualizing wealth within systems of labor, industry, and land use, the narrative moves beyond glorification. The house becomes a case study rather than a celebration. This intellectual framing invites engagement rather than rejection. Visitors are encouraged to ask difficult questions. Who built this? Who maintained it? Who benefited? Who sacrificed? These questions do not weaken the estate's story. They strengthen it by grounding it in reality. Places that avoid such questions do not survive cultural shifts. Biltmore's willingness to confront complexity has made it resilient to criticism. It does not claim moral perfection. It claims historical significance and present-day responsibility. This distinction matters. As society continues to reevaluate the legacies of wealth and power, institutions that cling to nostalgia will be swept aside. Those that embrace accountability endure. Another challenge lies in generational continuity. Family ownership has been a defining strength, but it is also a potential fault line. Each generation must choose stewardship anew. Commitment cannot be inherited passively. It must be renewed actively. This renewal requires education within the family itself. Future stewards must understand not only the estate's history, but its vulnerabilities. They must be prepared to make unpopular decisions. They must value restraint as much as ambition. There is no guarantee that future generations will share this mindset. This uncertainty haunts every long-lived private estate. Biltmore mitigates it through governance structures, professional management, and institutional memory. Decisions are not left solely to sentiment. Expertise guides policy. Data informs planning. Emotion remains present, but it is disciplined. This discipline distinguishes stewardship from possession. Possession asks what can be enjoyed. Stewardship asks what must be protected. Biltmore's survival depends on the latter question being asked again and again. As the estate looks forward, new dilemmas emerge. Digital engagement expands reach but risks reducing physical connection. Virtual experiences can educate, but they may also substitute visitation. Changing travel patterns affect tourism. Younger generations engage with history differently. Biltmore must remain legible to audiences who did not grow up admiring grand houses. This requires narrative evolution without distortion. The estate increasingly frames itself not as a fantasy of wealth, but as an exploration of scale, ambition, and consequence. The story becomes less about admiration and more about inquiry. Why was something like this built? What did it require? What did it displace? What lessons does it offer now? This approach aligns with contemporary values. Curiosity replaces awe. Understanding replaces envy. Preservation becomes a shared responsibility rather than a spectacle. In this way, Biltmore's refusal to fail extends beyond architecture. It becomes an argument about how societies remember and care for their past, not by freezing it, not by erasing it, but by continuously renegotiating its meaning. The mansion still stands because each era has been willing to ask hard questions and accept uncomfortable answers, because survival was never assumed, because adaptation was never postponed, because stewardship was treated as labor, not inheritance. As long as those principles hold, Biltmore will remain what it has always been at its core, not a monument to certainty, but a testament to vigilance. And vigilance, more than wealth or stone, is what ultimately refuses to fail.